From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Senator Franken, I'm not aware of any of those activities. I have been called a surrogate at a time or two in that campaign, and I did not have communications with the Russians.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions is facing calls to resign over failing to reveal to senators 2 meetings he had with Russia's top diplomat in Washington at a time last year when he was a surrogate for the Trump campaign. We'll speak with David Cay Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of The Making of Donald Trump, and James Henry, who's probed the curious world of Trump's private Russian connections. Then, as Donald Trump continues his crackdown on immigrants, we'll look at the shocking case of an asylum seeker from El Salvador who's being detained as she battles a brain tumor.
Free Sarah now! ICE! Free Sarah now! ICE!
We'll speak with Sarah Beltran-Hernandez's attorney, as well as Amnesty International, which is calling on ICE to release the ill woman. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Justice Department said Wednesday Attorney General Jeff Sessions met twice last year with Russia's ambassador to the United States, contradicting sworn testimony by Sessions to Congress. The disclosure renewed calls for a special prosecutor to investigate ties between the Trump campaign and Russia's government, and prompted calls from senior Democrats for Sessions to resign. During his confirmation hearing in January to become Attorney General, then Senator Sessions was asked by Minnesota Senator Al Franken whether he knew of contacts between Trump campaign officials and Russia's government.
If there is any evidence that anyone affiliated with the Trump campaign communicated with the Russian government in the course of this campaign, what will you do?
Senator Franken, I'm not aware of any of those activities. I have been called a surrogate at a time or two in that campaign, and I did not have communications with the Russians.
The Washington Post reported Wednesday Sessions twice met with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak in July on the sidelines of the Republican National Convention, and in September in Sessions' office on Capitol Hill. And the Wall Street Journal reports federal investigators are probing Sessions' contacts with Russian officials. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi on Wednesday accused Sessions of apparent perjury and said in a statement, quote, "Sessions is not fit to serve as the top law enforcement officer of our country and must resign," end quote. Joining the call was Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings, the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. Many top Democrats are calling for a special prosecutor to investigate ties between top Trump officials and Russia's government. At least one top Republican senator said Wednesday he's open to the idea. This is South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham speaking on CNN.
It is clear to me that Jeff Sessions, who is my dear friend, cannot make this decision about Trump. So there may be nothing there, but if there's something there that the FBI believes is criminal in nature, then for sure you need a special prosecutor.
The Washington Post asked members of the Senate Armed Services Committee if they'd had contact with Russia's ambassador in the run-up to November's election. 19 of the 26 committee members who responded said no. In a statement, Attorney General Sessions said, quote, "I never met with any Russian officials to discuss issues of the campaign. I have no idea what this allegation is about. It's false," he said. Meanwhile, the New York Times reports that the Obama administration scrambled during its final days in office to preserve evidence of Russia's collusion with the Trump campaign. Citing unnamed former officials, the Times says Obama's aides left a trail of evidence across different government agencies to prevent the incoming Trump administration from covering up or destroying evidence. The White House is seeking to dramatically reduce the power of the Environmental Protection Agency, slashing dozens of programs and laying off 20% of the EPA staff. The plan calls for the complete elimination of EPA programs on climate change, toxic waste cleanup, environmental justice, and funding for native Alaskan villages. It would slash funding to states for clean air and water programs by 30%. In a statement to the Washington Post, William Becker of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies said, quote, "These cuts, if enacted by Congress, will rip the heart and soul out of the National Air Pollution Control Program and jeopardize the health and welfare of tens of millions of people around the country." Former Republican Congressmember Ryan Zinke was sworn in Wednesday as Secretary of the Interior. Vice President Mike Pence administered the oath of office in a ceremony at the White House.
We're confident that your record of leadership, integrity, and public service will see to our nation's great natural resources and treasures as if they were your own. You'll look after and be a steward of the interior of this nation and the vast natural resources of this nation with the same commitment to principle and integrity that has characterized your life.
Former Congressmember Ryan Zinke has long promoted mining and logging on federally held lands. He's indicated he's open to reversing a ban on oil drilling in the Arctic. Zinke has also denied scientists have proven the human impact on climate change. In climate news, new research finds spring is arriving in the Northern Hemisphere far earlier than it did a decade ago. The report in the journal Biology Letters found that spring arrived 22 days ahead of normal in Washington, D.C. this year, while in the Arctic, some plant species began sprouting nearly a month earlier than normal. Meanwhile, an Argentine research base in Antarctica reported Wednesday it recorded a record high temperature of 63.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The findings are consistent with models for global warming and came as the last 3 years were successively the hottest on record. In immigration news, ICE officers arrested 22-year-old undocumented immigrant Daniela Vargas in Jackson, Mississippi Wednesday, shortly after she spoke out publicly in a news conference about the detention of her family. The arrest further stoked fears that the Trump administration is cracking down against dreamers, immigrants brought to the U.S. as children who received permission to live and work in the U.S. under President Obama's DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. At the time of her arrest, Vargas had a pending application for renewal of her DACA status. Meanwhile, police chiefs from cities across the U.S. are resisting a move by the Trump administration to enlist local police officers to help deport undocumented immigrants. The White House plan would also withhold federal funds from sanctuary cities that refuse to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. In a joint letter sent to Congress Tuesday, 61 sheriffs and police chiefs wrote, quote, "We can best serve our communities by leaving the enforcement of immigration laws to the federal government. Threatening the removal of valuable grant funding from jurisdictions that choose not to spend limited resources enforcing federal immigration law is extremely problematic," they said. President Donald Trump wants to give Defense Secretary James Mattis and other top military officials a freer hand to launch military raids overseas without presidential approval. That's according to the Daily Beast, which reports the move could give wide latitude to generals to launch operations like the raid in Yemen that cost the life of a Navy SEAL and killed 25 civilians, including 9 children under the age of 13. President Trump told a joint session of Congress Tuesday the Yemen raid captured large amounts of vital intelligence that would prevent future terrorist attacks. But NBC News reports multiple military sources said raid produced no actionable intelligence. Meanwhile, a top UN official said U.S.-backed Saudi-led airstrikes are exacerbating Yemen's humanitarian catastrophe. UN Emergency Chief Coordinator Stephen O'Brien spoke to reporters while touring southern Yemen.
The best humanitarian solution for all the Yemeni people is the conflict stops, the guns fall silent. That's the best. And in the meantime, we have to do everything we can to support the people who have needs of food, of water, of warmth, and of medicines. And we need to also make sure that we do everything we can to protect civilians from the terrible threat of war and all the terrible abuses that go on.
O'Brien called for an end to a Saudi blockade of Yemen's ports to allow food and medicine to arrive. The UN warns some 14 million Yemenis are hungry and at risk of famine. In Iraq, residents of the besieged city of Mosul say an airstrike leveled a mosque and flattened nearby homes, killing both ISIS fighters and civilians. At least 3 witnesses told Reuters they were unable to count the number of dead because the situation remained too dangerous. A Pentagon spokesperson said he wasn't aware of a strike targeting the mosque. The blast came as a coalition of U.S., Kurdish and Iraqi forces seized control of the last major road out of Mosul Wednesday, trapping ISIS militants in the western half of the city. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's claiming responsibility for attacks across the capital, Kabul, Thursday, which killed 16 people and wounded dozens more. One suicide attack targeted an Afghan intelligence agency building. Another suicide bomb struck a police precinct in western Kabul. This is one of the officers wounded in the blast.
I was in the office when I heard an explosion. Right after the explosion, I took up a position and I tried to get out of the office. When the second explosion took place, I became unconscious, and when I opened my eyes, I found myself on the hospital bed.
In Syria, a top U.S. general said Wednesday Russian warplanes mistakenly bombed Syrian anti-government fighters who were being trained by the United States. Army Lieutenant General Stephen Townsend said U.S. advisors were close to the assault when the bombing occurred. Russia's defense ministry denied its warplanes fired on positions held by the U.S.-backed Syrian Arab coalition. Meanwhile, the United Nations said Wednesday the Syrian military deliberately targeted a UN aid convoy near Aleppo last September, calling the forced evacuation of opposition-held parts of the east of the city a war crime. In Canada, 3 adult children of President Donald Trump joined a ribbon-cutting ceremony Wednesday for the new Trump International Hotel and Tower in Vancouver. This is Donald Trump Jr.
Coming from someone that has some experience with generational family businesses, I know how it's not always so easy. Not always so easy. I'd like to thank the press. Just kidding. It's great to see you here. I'm shocked. I'm absolutely shocked. But no, it is great to be here. This has been an amazing journey.
Protesters gathered outside Wednesday's ribbon-cutting ceremony, which also featured Eric and Tiffany Trump, where protesters chanted and held signs proclaiming "Love Trump's hate." CNN reports the Vancouver high-rise will cater to wealthy investors like an executive at a major Abu Dhabi bank seeking to park their money in real estate investments. The Trump Organization doesn't directly own the tower, but will instead collect licensing fees from the project's owner. Many government ethics experts say the investment puts President Trump at risk of violating the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, which prohibits people holding federal office from accepting payments from foreign governments. We'll look at President Trump's link to that Vancouver tower after headlines. In Georgia, a judge handed down the final 2 sentences this week against a group of 15 white people who terrorized black residents of the city of Douglasville, driving around town in pickup trucks emblazoned with Confederate flags, shouting racial slurs and threatening to shoot black people. Witnesses testified over 2 days in July of 2015. Members of the group, which called itself Respect the Flag, shouted the N-word at black motorists, harassed customers at local businesses. At one point, the group drove onto the property of a black resident who was holding a birthday party for an 8-year-old child, shouting death threats and pointing a gun at the children. Members of the group were found guilty of violating a street gang terrorism law with prison sentences of up to 13 years. The incident came only a month after white supremacist Dylan Roof, who appeared in photos holding a pistol and waving a Confederate flag, massacred 9 worshipers at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And legendary talk show host and actor Oprah Winfrey hinted Wednesday she's open to running for president in 2020. Oprah was asked about a possible run for the White House during an interview with David Rubenstein of Bloomberg TV.
I actually never thought that was, I never considered the question even a possibility. I just thought, oh.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration is facing a new scandal as the Justice Department has acknowledged Attorney General Jeff Sessions met twice last year with Russia's ambassador to the United States. This contradicts Sessions' sworn testimony to Congress. During his confirmation hearing in January, then Senator Sessions was asked by Minnesota Senator Al Franken whether he knew of contacts between Trump campaign surrogates and Russia's government.
If there is any evidence that anyone affiliated with the Trump campaign communicated with the Russian government in the course of this campaign, what will you do?
Senator Franken, I'm not aware of any of those activities. I have been called a surrogate at a time or two in that campaign, and I did not have communications with the Russians.
The Washington Post reported Wednesday that Sessions twice met with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak in July on the sidelines of the Republican National Convention and in September in Sessions' office on Capitol Hill. And the Wall Street Journal reports that federal investigators are probing Sessions' contacts with Russian officials. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi Wednesday accused Sessions of apparent perjury and said in a statement, quote, "Sessions is not fit to serve as the top law enforcement officer of our country and must resign," unquote. Joining the call was Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings, ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. Many top Democrats are calling for a special prosecutor to investigate ties between top Trump officials and Russia's government. At least one top Republican senator said Wednesday he's open to the idea. This is South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham speaking on CNN.
It is clear to me that Jeff Sessions, who is my dear friend, cannot make this decision about Trump. So there may be nothing there, but if there's something there that the FBI believes is criminal in nature, then for sure you need a special prosecutor.
Earlier this morning, Attorney General Jeff Sessions briefly spoke with an NBC reporter.
Well, I have not met with any Russians at any time to discuss any political campaign, and those remarks are unbelievable to me and are false, and I don't have anything else to say about that. So thank you.
We're joined now by two guests. David Cay Johnston is the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, formerly with the New York Times. He's author of the book, The Making of Donald Trump. He is the founder and editor of the DCReport.org. Also with us is economist and lawyer James Henry, who's investigated Trump's ties to Russia. His most recent report is titled Another Cabinet Pick with Secret Ties to Putin and Oligarchs. He's talking about Wilbur Ross. But I want to turn first to David Cay Johnston. So much has been revealed in the last 24 hours, David, both by the Washington Post and the New York Times. Can you talk about the significance of these revelations?
Well, their significance is that it shows how we have to have an open public investigation of Donald Trump. And to paraphrase Richard Nixon, people have got to know that their president is not a traitor. The Intelligence Committee chairman in the House, Representative Nunes, has already said, well, I haven't seen anything. Of course, he hasn't started his investigation, but we don't need to have the intelligence committees, which meet in secret, investigate this, and we don't need a special prosecutor. What we need is a public investigation, beginning with getting Donald Trump's tax returns, not only the ones that the IRS has in its possession and they can subpoena from Trump if he hasn't destroyed them, but also those that he's had to produce in litigation around the country, have the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation review those so that we know how much money Trump got from the Russians, which Russians, who he's paid interest to, who he has business partnerships with. And notice how desperate Donald Trump is to make sure we do not investigate this. How Jeff Sessions tries to blow off the fact that he spoke to the Russian ambassador and yet twice in a hearing and then in a letter said he'd had no contact with the Russians when he was, by his own account, a surrogate for the Trump campaign. This is very, very important, Amy, and we really need to make sure there is an open public investigation and this is not swept under the Intelligence Committee rug.
Well, let's talk about what Attorney General Sessions said. He said as a surrogate for the Trump campaign, he was clearly making a distinction between that and being a senator. But the Washington Post polled 19 of the 26 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, on which he serves, and none of them said that they had met with the Russian ambassador to the United States, David.
Well, yes, and I think it's very significant that he was later asked in writing another question, and his answer was one word: no. Jeff Sessions is an experienced politician. He has been masterful at obscuring his racist conduct and attitudes. That's how he got all the way to Attorney General. And here he has shown at a minimum, at an absolute minimum, that he cannot have anything to do with the investigation of Donald Trump. He was the first senator to back Donald Trump. He has made it clear that he doesn't think there's anything here. And so he has to recuse himself at an absolute minimum from any involvement. What Donald Trump wants first and foremost here, Amy, is to make sure there is not a proper investigation. And Donald Trump, who I've known nearly 30 years, has a long history of compromising the FBI, compromising grand juries, compromising the Federal Office of Ethics, the New Jersey Attorney General's office, so that investigations of him are not properly done. People really need to make sure and demand that we have an open, public, bipartisan, no-holds-barred investigation, and it starts with review of Donald Trump's tax returns, which Congress has the right to see under a 1920s law.
I want to go to Senator Jeff Sessions speaking in 1999 when he backed the impeachment of President Bill Clinton.
As a former federal prosecutor for 12 years, attorney general for 2 years, I know and believe very deeply in the rule of law and the fact that honest and testimony is required if we're to have justice in America. So the problem is not the personal conduct. People on both sides of the aisle have failed in their dedication to their families over and over again. We know that to be true. But the fact is that we're dealing and wrestling with allegations that suggest perjury or obstruction of justice. The president has a full and should be given a full opportunity to respond to that. But fundamentally, we're going to have to wrestle with that, and that issue will not go away.
There is Senator Sessions talking about perjury and obstruction of justice, the significance of this, David Cay Johnston.
Well, in the case of Donald Trump, keep in mind, Donald Trump lies as easily as you and I breathe. He is, by becoming president of the United States, the #1 con artist in the history of the world. He has spent his entire adult life deeply in the embrace of violent felons, Russian mobsters, American mobsters, assorted swindlers and crooks. He has cheated his own workers out of their pay. He has cheated small business people out of their fees. He has swindled investors in properties that were branded with the Trump name. And so it's absolutely critical to understand that you can't rely on anything that Donald Trump says as president of the United States, but especially when he knows that he's got stuff in his closet to hide. Now, my colleague Jim Henry, who wrote his report for DC Report, my nonprofit news organization, has spent a lot of time digging into the Russian connections here, and they are vast, deep. They go back more than 30 years. And an important element to understand about why this matters with the Russians. Who are the Russian oligarchs? They are a state-sponsored network of international criminals. And Donald Trump has had so many involvements with them, involving the Trump Soho Hotel, the sale of property, and other things Jim can talk about. And then we get Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, who is in bed with these guys right up to his eyeballs.
Okay, we're going to talk about all of that in a moment. David Cay Johnston with us from Rochester, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, author of The Making of Donald Trump. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with him and Jim Henry in a moment. by Vagabond here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our discussion about the Trump administration facing a new scandal, as the Justice Department has acknowledged that Attorney General Jeff Sessions met twice last year with Russia's ambassador to the United States, contradicting sworn testimony Sessions gave during his confirmation hearing. We are talking to David Cay Johnston, the investigative reporter, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, as well as James Henry, economist, lawyer, who's investigated Trump's ties to Russia. His most recent report is titled Another Cabinet Pick with Secret Ties to Putin and Oligarchs. But I want to begin, Jim, with you talking about these revelations that have just come out and what you find most significant.
Well, I think the contradiction in the Sessions speech to the talk to the UN, to the Senate, and also his, a conflict of interest here, I think, in terms of having to preside over the FBI investigation at the same time that he may well have had conversation. This guy Kiselak is a pretty significant player in the Russian orbit. He was the fellow who had the conversations with Flynn that got Flynn into trouble. And the Russians have said themselves that they had all kinds of contacts with the Trump team. So here we find Sessions trying to draw this kind of phony boundary between what he does as a senator and what he does as one of the leading foreign policy advisors to the Trump candidacy. So I think, this just has an odor of impropriety to it, and he ought to recuse himself. I don't know whether the answer is a special prosecutor or some other approach, but I do think that he's basically discredited himself.
And you also have the New York Times expose today that we just talked about in the headlines. The New York Times reporting the Obama administration scrambled during its final days in office to preserve evidence of Russia's collusion with the Trump campaign. Citing unnamed former officials, the Times says Obama's aides left a trail of evidence across different government agencies to prevent the incoming Trump administration from covering up or destroying the evidence. The trail including passing sensitive information to Congress, keeping evidence at a relatively low classification level so a number of people could see it, also sharing information with European allies. I mean, you have situations like, the NSA picks up a lot of information and it's not culled through, but they started to go through it, gather that information, categorize it, and start to disseminate it. The significance of this.
Well, I think first of all, they have our own intelligence community obviously very concerned about this administration. But the second thing that I picked up from that report, Amy, was that we have the Dutch, the UK, the German agencies as well, basically beginning to corroborate some of the elements of the Steele memorandum, which, came out originally last summer. This is the MI6 guy who is making all these allegations about Trump compromat and the Rosneft deal, a lot of details there. But basically, we're finding that these other intelligence agencies, the United States is not the only organization, not the only country with intelligence agencies, they are coming out with findings that are basically corroborating some of the elements of that commission, that there were, in fact, meetings of the Trump team with Russians in Europe during the period that the Steele memorandum claimed. So that's also very important, and I think we're going to have to see exactly what that means.
In Canada yesterday, you had Trump's address to the joint session of Congress on Tuesday night. I believe the only, or one of the only, world leaders he mentioned was Justin Trudeau Tuesday night. Well, yesterday in Canada, in Vancouver, President Trump's children, Tiffany, as well as Eric and Donald Trump Jr., who run his empire, joined a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Trump International Hotel and Tower in Vancouver. I just wanted to play a clip of, this is Don Trump Jr.
Coming from someone that has some experience with generational family businesses, I know how it's not always so easy. Not always so easy. I'd like to thank the press Just kidding. It's great to see you here. I'm shocked. I'm absolutely shocked. But no, it is great to be here. This has been an amazing journey.
So, James Henry, you're an economist. This is a hotel, the first Trump hotel and apartment building, a tower, that has been opened since, I believe, Trump has become president. Talk about the significance of this Vancouver tower.
Well, I contrast it with the Toronto Tower, which just went bankrupt, and where Donald Trump had some very strange business partners, some of them connected to our favorite folks, the Russians. So I wrote a long piece about all this in the American Interest in December. You can dig it out. But, look, I think that the Trump family should be encouraged to do business. I mean, it's great that they're out making towers around the planet. In fact, the whole family should go back to what they probably do best, which is building tower hotels. But the impact of this tower, I mean, is going to be I think it's unclear how much employment it will create, or whether the market that they're targeting isn't just the ultra affluent. That's typically their style. But I think the most important issues that we've been trying to understand here is all the incredible affiliations and partners that he's had. Dubious partners from Russia and the former Soviet Union, a lot of money flowing into his organizations from Russian capital flight. And essentially what Donald always says is, I don't have any business in Russia. That's not the point. The point is he's done an awful lot of business with Russians, and a lot of those projects basically look a lot like money laundering projects. So I hope that
talk about this. So talk about this when it comes to Vancouver, and specifically, just having read your piece, talk about Felix Sater and who he is.
Right. Felix Sater is a convicted felon. He also happened to run a company with a partner called Bayrock, which was a big investor in the project called the Trump Soho, which basically went belly up. Bayrock no longer exists. It went bankrupt. But Felix and his partner, have been accused of being a conduit to former Soviet Union money that was flowing into these projects. That's a matter of litigation. It's before the courts now. But it is the case that the farther you look into Felix and his partners, the more curious the situation becomes. He was convicted and then had a very generous plea deal in 2000 from our former Attorney General Loretta Lynch, despite the fact that he'd been convicted of felonies for a huge $40 million financial scam. He never served a day in jail. He then did a kind of very big plea bargain with the Justice Department, and essentially we think he may have been helping the CIA repurchase Stinger missiles in Afghanistan with the help of his Russian friends. Anyway, that's another whole smoking gun we need to investigate. But Sater, to this day, has been involved in his latest thing was to propose a kind of a relaxed sanctions on Russia with respect to the Ukraine just in January, using Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, as a conduit. So this guy, the fact that these kinds of people are floating around the Trump organization and just in and out of the door is very disturbing. And, my piece goes into a lot of the different networks. And
but with staying on Felix Sater, you actually show the business card of Felix Sater, which we will show right here, which says Felix H. Sater, and on top it says Trump, the Trump Organization.
That's right. I mean, he was at a certain point an advisor to Trump. He was meeting with him in his office. They were scheming to do projects all over the planet. He was making campaign contributions to the Trump Organization, this summer. They have distanced themselves from him. I mean, he has this is a fellow who's been convicted of slashing somebody with a margarita glass. The issue more broadly, just beyond Felix Sater, is how do we get to the bottom of all of these allegations. I think that David's point about needing some kind of independent investigation, maybe a national commission on this whole issue, just to clear the air, is essentially the way to go. But the most recent report that I've been doing, I wanted to just turn to that because, the Sater story has been done. We know it's out there. It still needs work. But, the most interesting thing I've come up with lately is about our new Secretary of Commerce investing in a Russian-owned bank that's basically up to the minute involved in money laundering. And he's got 3 partners in that bank who are wealthy oligarchs, one of whom was a KGB agent appointed by Putin to the bank. This is the Bank of Cyprus. And at least 50% of that bank is Russian-owned. So Wilbur Ross is what the fellow we're talking about. We presented our report over the weekend. Several U.S. senators took the material there and asked Ross questions about all of his connections with these folks. But he never responded. And on Monday, the U.S. Senate voted 72 to 27 in his favor. I just find this outrageous, Amy. It's something that, yet another case.
But talk more specifically about Wilbur Ross, again, the wealthiest, I believe, of the cabinet members. Your subtitle, "There's Still Time for Senators," well, this is before Wilbur Ross was confirmed, to examine Wilbur Ross and his mysterious Russian-controlled bank in Cyprus. Talk more specifically about this and the money he made and why this matters right now.
Well, he invested in this bank, which is the largest bank in Cyprus. It has a long Cyprus is a big offshore haven, especially for Russians. Most of the direct investments that go into Russia are going through Cyprus. And his first partner in the bank, his co-vice chairman, was a guy who was a KGB agent appointed to that position by Putin because there were a lot of Russian shareholders in the bank after it went belly up. A second partner was the potash czar of Russia, worth about $8 billion, a guy named Rybolovlev. And Dmitry Rybolovlev not only sold Donald Trump bought Donald Trump's house in 2008 for $95 million in Palm Beach, but he was also tagged as bird-dogging the president on the campaign trail, intersecting with his landings in places like Charlotte, North Carolina, and Concord and Las Vegas, all over the campaign trail, and flying his Airbus 319 on these same routes. So what was he up to? Why was Rybolovlev, intersecting with the president's campaign? And the third partner was a fellow named Vekselberg, who is another big GARP, Russian investor. He has 4 companies in Switzerland, one of which has been implicated in intelligence spying for, tapping people's internet connections. So, this is kind of unacceptable. The final thing is that Wilbur Ross personally nominated as the CEO of this Bank of Cyprus, this Russian haven bank, the former head of Deutsche Bank, which is just, as David said, implicated in something like $10 billion of Russian money laundering. And Joseph Ackerman was there for 10 years. All of this happened on his watch. His reward is to become head of the Wilbur Ross-run Bank of Cyprus. So,
he was fined $650 million for helping launder Russian money through Deutsche Bank offices in Moscow, New York, and Cyprus. Deutsche Bank, as you point out, is Trump's largest known lender, having extended him more than $300 million of loans that remain outstanding.
That's right. So anyway, all this nets out to, a whole lot of smoke. A few fires breaking, more and more contradictions in the administration's position. And I would say if you were looking at this statistically, we're now up to maybe the odds of this happening just by probability is like 1 in 10,000. There is something going on with this administration. It's the only way, for example, you could really explain all of the positions that Donald Trump takes that are perfectly aligned with those of Vladimir Putin on NATO, on the EU, on pipelines, on human rights, on immigration. I mean, it's like they're kissing cousins. So.
I want to turn to Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren speaking out against Wilbur Ross's confirmation just this past Monday before he was confirmed.
Mr. Ross is a Wall Street billionaire with a long history of profiting from the suffering of others. He also has shady ties to Vladimir Putin's Russia. This is not normal. And it is shameful if we ignore all of it as we evaluate the president's nominees to critical foreign policy and national security jobs.
So that was Senator Elizabeth Warren. With that, he was confirmed. But I want to wrap up with David Cay Johnston. This breaking news has just come in, David. House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy and House Oversight and Government Reform Committee Chair Jason Chaffetz, of course both Republican, are calling on Attorney General Jeff Sessions to recuse himself from a Justice Department probe into alleged ties between Trump campaign officials and Russia's government. So some elected officials are calling on him to recuse himself, and others are calling for his resignation. If you can summarize what James Henry has said and where you think this is all headed.
Well, I think all of this is headed to serious trouble for Donald Trump. I said during the campaign, I didn't believe Trump could get through 1 year as president of the United States. If the question we need to ask is, why did the Republicans up until now not want to know, and what do they not want to know? There is so much smoke coming out of the basement of this building that if the fire department said, oh, there's no fire, there's just smoke, and didn't respond after the building burned down, we'd all talk about what an incredible scandal it is. And I think you're now seeing that the really experienced professional politicians among the Republicans are beginning to realize that their interests and Donald Trump's interests are not aligned. You're going to see them stop defending Donald Trump's lies, his excuses, his utter incompetence, and protect themselves. If they're smart, they will agree to a no-holds-barred investigation. And, of course, if they get rid of Donald Trump as president, either through impeachment or exercising the 25th Amendment, in which the cabinet and the vice president can effectively remove the president and make Mike Pence vice president, they then get one of their own, Mike Pence, in the White House. But this is the beginning of the end, not the beginning. And all that's required now is a thorough, honest, open, no-holds-barred, bipartisan investigation to get at the connections. And what Jim has shown in his long report for DCReport.org is by itself compelling enough to raise questions about what in the world is going on in the Republicans not asking the right questions. And hopefully these announcements that were just made by Jason Chaffetz and Congressman Brady will signal that we now are in a shift and that the Republicans on Capitol Hill are looking out not for Donald Trump, not for the Republican Party, but for our country, so that we can get to the issue of, to paraphrase Richard Nixon again, people have got to know their president is not a traitor. And if he is, they've got to remove him yesterday.
We'll leave it there. Again, that breaking news, House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy and House Oversight and Government Reform Committee Chair Jason Chaffetz, both calling on Attorney General Jeff Sessions to recuse himself. David Cay Johnston, we're going to link to your pieces, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, author of The Making of Donald Trump, former New York Times reporter. And thank you so much to James Henry, economist, lawyer, and senior advisor with the Tax Justice Network. We will link to your pieces in the American Interests and DCReport.org. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, an immigrant fleeing from violence in El Salvador comes to the United States. She's in the hospital with a brain tumor. ICE takes her in handcuffs back to jail. Stay with us. Tu Nombre, With Your Name, by Raquel Sofia, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As President Trump continues his crackdown on immigrants, we turn to a shocking case of an asylum seeker from El Salvador who's being detained as she battles a brain tumor. Sara Beltran-Hernandez first came to the U.S. by crossing the U.S.-Mexico border in November of 2015. She immediately gave a sworn statement to Border Patrol agents that she sought to escape death threats she'd received from gang members in her hometown because her partner is a police officer. Since then, she's been held in various jails, detention centers, while her asylum case is pending. Then on February 10th, Sara Beltran collapsed while she was held at the Prairieland Detention Center near Dallas, Texas. The 27-year-old mother of two was taken to the Texas Health Hospital. She was also bleeding from her nose and reportedly suffering convulsions and memory loss. Doctors diagnosed her with a brain tumor more than half an inch in diameter and said she needed surgery. It took 8 days before she was given permission to call her relatives to tell them where she was and the state of her health. Her lawyer asked she be transferred to a hospital in New York City close to where her family lives, but the request was rejected. Last week, the staff at the Huguley Hospital reportedly told Beltran she would be transferred to another hospital for an operation, but instead she was removed from the hospital with her wrists and ankles shackled together in handcuffs and taken back to jail. This week, doctors told Sara Beltran she has a large pituitary macroadenoma tumor that is not life-threatening, but, quote, could continue to grow and needs close monitoring and regular MRIs. She still suffers from severe pain in her head, numbness in her face, has difficulty walking. Today, she has a bond hearing before an immigration judge who could grant her release. For more, we're going to Dallas, Texas, to speak with Sara Beltran-Hernandez's attorney, Fatma Maroof. She is also the director of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic at Texas A&M University, where she's a professor of law. Also joining us in Dallas is Bryn Esplin, assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Medicine at Texas A&M School of Medicine, where she teaches bioethics. On Monday, Esplin accompanied Sara to her doctor's appointment and has spoken to her in detention about the care she received. Here in New York, Justin Mazzola joins us, Deputy Director of Research for Amnesty International USA, which has launched a campaign calling on ICE to release Sara immediately. Welcome to all of you. Let's begin with Fatma Maroof. You are her lawyer. Can you tell us how it's possible that this woman suffering from a brain tumor is taken out of the hospital in shackles back to the detention center?
It came as a great shock, I think, to all of us. It happened a day after I had attempted to visit her in the hospital and was refused entry into her room, where she had two guards from the detention center posted at all times.
She had two guards. This woman,
yes.
Had she committed a terrible crime?
She has no criminal history whatsoever. She was simply fleeing for her life. So the detention center, when they took her to the hospital, they left two guards who never left her side. And she spent, as you mentioned, several days there, almost a week, and was denied access to her attorneys as well as to her family. So she was just alone, terrified, not speaking English.
How did you find her,
told
Fatma?
that she has a brain tumor. So after I went to the hospital to try to understand what was happening, and subsequently talked to people within the Department of Homeland Security as well as within the hospital, we were told that she would be moved to a hospital in Dallas, and then suddenly the next day she was taken back. So we're not exactly sure what happened. There's a couple different discharge notes in her medical records, and it seems that the doctors decided that she was stable all of a sudden that day and released her back to immigration custody. But they had scheduled an appointment for her after the following Monday. And we were very concerned about this sort of break in her health care, where she was going to have to go back to the detention center, where the care is extremely limited. She's visited only once a day by a nurse in the detention center. She's receiving Tylenol for a brain tumor, and we didn't know how urgently she needed the surgery at that time.
So she was in the hospital for 8 days. No one knew where she was when she had just been given information that she had a brain tumor?
That's right. So I think when she first got there, she somehow managed to make a call to her mother and told her mother where she was. But then what happened was ICE put her on what they called a no-contact list, which is something I've never heard of before. But it basically keeps the location of the patient a secret, and so she's not even registered at the hospital. So when her family tried calling the hospital to ask for her, they would just say there's nobody here by that name. And so as somebody locally in the area, I was asked to go and see if she was there, and I found her there. But I was denied access by those guards in the room who actually, yelled at me and said no one's supposed to even know she's here.
Bryn Esplin, can you talk about your concerns as a bioethicist about what has happened to Sara Beltran, a woman who is fleeing violence, fleeing for her life from El Salvador to the United States?
Sure. So from a bioethics and medical ethics standpoint, there are numerous concerns, some of which we've hinted at already. I was made privy to the case and concerned when I heard that she was on a no-contacts list. And I thought that I could prevail upon other hospital services, such as the chaplaincy or social work, to get involved and to offer her some support. Because as you said, she was told that she was suffering from a brain tumor, and the nature of a neurological condition like that obviously impacts the ability to comprehend, to have memory. She had symptoms that were aligned with this injury. Not being able to reach out to social support, to share in decision-making, to talk about her condition were extremely problematic. So I was thinking that would work. Chaplaincy seemed very receptive to intervening and providing spiritual care. And so at that point, I sort of recused myself and thought that all was well. And then, as we mentioned, she was discharged suddenly back to the detention center and told that she would have a follow-up appointment on Monday with a neurosurgeon. And so at that point, I felt a moral obligation to go and meet with Sara in person at the detention center to get a sense of how she was doing, just from a human being standpoint, but also what she understood about the nature and extent of her condition, what opportunities she had to ask meaningful questions, how I could better support her. Because her English is limited, it was very difficult for her to comprehend all of the nuances of a neurological injury, like a pituitary tumor. And so I asked if she would feel comfortable with me coming with her to her appointment on Monday, and she enthusiastically agreed. And so I had her sign a written statement to that effect and also sign a document releasing health information to me. And so I showed up early to her appointment and met with the clinical staff, explained who I was in a patient advocacy capacity, and waited for her to arrive. And I can confirm unequivocally that she arrived not only in handcuffs, but shackled from the hands, waists, and feet, brought into the clinic where all the other people in the visiting room were made privy to this, could see and hear her, and was escorted back to the examination room. And it was only when a clinical staff asked her to sit on the patient examination table, and she struggled to do so in these chains, when the officer was prompted to then remove the shackles. And so I sat there with her, held her hand, tried to make the best of a telephonic interpreter that the officers were trying to use to help her fill out this past medical history and forms. That was not working. Both the connection was terrible and the nature of these technical medical jargons was just very difficult to translate. And so this hospital staff insisted that a person come and translate. And so we waited for nearly 45 minutes to an hour for that person to arrive. Sara was still suffering from severe symptoms, laid down, held her head, had to be aroused when the nurse came back into the room. And then we met with a doctor, and it was just concerning to me that all of these other people, not just the clinical staff and the physician, were made privy to very personal health information. And so it's difficult to talk about and be honest about past medical information such as HIV status, heightened protected health information like psychiatric history. And all of a sudden, these strangers are in her room hearing her past medical history, her current prognosis and diagnosis. And I think that from an ethical standpoint, really impedes the ability to give accurate information and feel trusted and be able to then ask questions in a meaningful way.
I want to bring Justin.
So all of those.
I want to bring Justin Mazzola into this conversation, the Deputy Director of Research for Amnesty International USA, which has launched a campaign aimed at winning Sarah Beltran's release from detention. Now, we just had the state, not exactly a State of the Union address, but President Trump's address to the joint session of Congress, and he keeps on repeating he's going after the bad hombres. He's going after the criminals that threaten our national security. Can you talk about how Sarah Beltran fits into this, who she is, this woman from El Salvador?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, you have to remember that she was detained under the Obama administration, and their response to the flood of families and even unaccompanied children coming up from the Northern Triangle who are fleeing instability and violence in those countries, including El Salvador, where Sarah's from. And the policy of the administration then was detention as deterrence. And so they wanted to send a message that if you do come, this is what you're going to face. And Secretary Jeh Johnson was very vocal about that and was criticized for that, but continued the policy. And so you have asylum seekers, people who are fleeing violence, gang violence, in Sarah's case also domestic violence, who are coming up here, and as they cross the border and say that they have a fear of going back to their home country, they're immediately detained pending a determination on their case.
We have 45 seconds. So explain what you're calling for right now.
So what we've been calling for all along is that ICE should be using their discretion with regards to their parole process to release her so that she can get adequate medical care and be able to live with her family who are already here
in New York,
until the challenge on her claim is completed.
And Fatma Maroof, what do you expect to come out of this? This is a bond hearing today?
This is a bond hearing before the Dallas Immigration Court, and we're hoping that the judge will issue a bond.
And do you know how much she will have to pay, whether she can do this?
We don't know until the judge issues the order. Her family has obviously been working hard to gather money in order to post a bond, and when we know the amount, then they will immediately post it if they have it.
Well, we will certainly continue to cover this. People should go to our website at democracynow.org, and we'll put out word today what happens in that hearing. Fatma Maroof, attorney for Sarah Beltran-Hernandez, bioethics expert Bryn Esplin, and Justin Mazzola of Amnesty International. Thank you so much. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.